today we have a very special guest, and joining me today is Luke Hare from the Territory Wildlife Park. And Luke and I are going to have a chat about snakes, some snakebite first aid, some myths about snakes. But first, before we get started, Luke, if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So obviously, as Gordon mentioned, my name's Luke, and I'm here with Bo, one of our friendly carpet pythons. And I've been working, I suppose, with snakes and reptiles generally on and off for about the last, I guess it's probably 35 years now. And yeah, it's sort of been an interest since I was fairly young. And have been here at the park for about 13 years, working a bit with these and with a lot of other things as well. But yeah, so it certainly keeps me busy, and yeah, one of my areas of interest, if you like.
Oh, great stuff. And what I thought we might just sort of hit it off by talking just a bit about snakes in general, some of the myths associated, and different sorts of snakes, and obviously talk about our the pythons. And we've got a carpet python here, Bo. And yeah, anything that you'd like to sort of just get the ball rolling?
Sure. Yeah. Well, you mentioned myths. There's a lot of those. There's heaps of myths about snakes. And you get to hear a few good ones. Working in this industry, you always hear a few good stories about snakes. One of the common ones that we hear is about snakes, how they hypnotise their prey by staring at it. But of course, snakes without any eyelids don't have any option but to stare. So it's not true at all that they hypnotise their prey by staring at it. They just don't have the ability to blink. So. Yeah, and in fact, on their eye, instead of an eyelid, they have a clear scale that protects the eye. And if a snake's comfortable enough with being handled, then to touch the eye is not really any drama for them. So yeah, that's a bit of a myth. There's another one about snakes when they bite themselves, particularly venomous snakes, of course, that they might kill themselves. Generally, that's a bit of a myth as well. They seem to be quite tolerant of their own venom, and so if they do happen to bite themselves, highly unlikely to kill themselves. Yeah, there's probably a bunch of other myths out there.
They don't seek out humans and that type of thing.
Chasing people, that's a great one. That's one that I do hear a lot about, snakes chasing people. In all the years that I've worked with snakes, lots of wild snakes and captive snakes, I've never seen a snake chase anybody, but some people might have a different interpretation of what chase is. When I encounter a snake, if I'm within a metre or a couple of metres and it starts to sort of strike or advance at me, I don't see that as being chased. If I turn and run and I look back and it's still coming after me, that's being chased. And I've never heard any credible account of a snake that has actually chased anyone like that. They will defend themselves, some of them more readily than others, if threatened. And that can be interpreted as being chased. Another thing that a lot of people will misinterpret is when they encounter a snake, the snake becomes aware of their presence, and the snake may have been living in a hole or under a rock here. The snake's over here, and they end up between the two. The snake comes directly for them. That's the way it looks. But what it's actually doing is trying to get to its hole, its hiding place.
Right.
And it's just assumed that it's coming for them. Where in fact, if they just stood still, quite possibly go right by them and into its hole.
And this snake, so with different, so obviously this is a python, a carpet python,
yep.
Of which there are many sorts. What are the main differences, say, between carpet python and say the venomous elapids and things like that?
So there's a number of differences when we're trying to identify snakes, and whether it's venomous or non-venomous. The best way, by the way, is a lot of practice, because trying to know whether it's venomous or non-venomous typically means you need to know what it is to know what it's not. Well, you can actually rule out a bunch of things, but that'll tell you what it is, and therefore you'll know whether it's venomous or non-venomous. And so we're looking at a bunch of different aspects of the snake when we're trying to identify it. Obviously, the colour and the patterning is one.
Beautiful.
She is. Yeah. You can give her a little pat if you like. She's very friendly. But the colour and the patterning is one. The size of the snake. Now, when I say the shape of the snake, what I mean is the length of the body in proportion to the thickness of the body. So, for example, a death adder is really short and stocky, and a golden tree snake's really long and slender. And of course, where the snake is, what it's doing, when it's doing it, is it up a tree? Is it on the ground? Is it in the water under a rock? Is it hiding, fleeing, hunting, all of those kind of things? Is it day or is it night? And we take that into account. If you can't tell, and we're also looking at the finish on the snake, is it
Quite
matte
matte,
or is it
yeah.
glossy? Some snakes will always appear matte and some will always appear glossy. And some, there's a bit of both. But if we still can't tell after taking all of those things into account, we can do what we refer to as scale counts, where we'll start to consider, we'll look at the ventral scales, the dorsal scales, and also the vent scale just under the tail there,
Right.
and the subcaudal scales along underneath the tail as well. A lot of pythons will have smaller dorsal scales, so scales on their back. I'm just going to try and undo her from my watch here.
Very strong.
She is quite strong. Mainly I just don't want to lift any of her scales and hurt her. She's being very good with me and not biting me. So, but yeah, the pythons have got often have a lot of smaller scales on the dorsal surface than the elapids, and they'll often have narrow ventral scales as well. Also, I'm just going to lift her off here. We can also start to look at some of the head scales, because there'll be a bunch of different snakes that have got different configurations, and some scales differ.
Just come over into the centre of it.
There we go. So yeah, but carpet pythons are pretty easy to tell. They're the most common species of python that we have.
You can see the head is definitely wider, but I noticed, say, on the water pythons, they've got quite a slender head, say, compared to a carpet python.
Yeah, a lot of our pythons will have this very broad, the back of the head is very broad here, with a very narrow front here. And it's almost like, if I can just free up my hand here, see if I can show you. So it's sort of a shape like that on a lot of pythons. But especially the black-headed pythons and the woma pythons have a very different shaped head. So the head shape is not the only thing. There's a bunch of others, and I didn't mention it before, but head shape and the shape of the eyes and that kind of thing is another one. If you look at her eyes, you can see there's not really a strong brow ridge overhead that's common in things like birds of prey, strong brow ridge, and it's probably there to cut glare from the sun, but you don't see it as much in nocturnal creatures because they're not trying to cut that glare.
And she detects a prey by smelling, obviously. You can see all those sort of scent. Are they scent glands in the front of her mouth? And
so what she's actually got there, she's using her tongue to smell. If I can turn her around so the camera can see there, but she's using her tongue to taste the air, and you can see her nostrils. But those little, I don't know if you can see there, I might try and bring her in close.
Like thermals.
Yeah, so she's got this ability to sense heat with those pits just under her nostrils and along her lower jaw there. I don't know if you can pick that up there in the camera, but those are used typically to sense body heat of her prey. And although they can certainly sense, any heat that's nearby, and what it means for her is that in the complete darkness, she doesn't need to be able to see her prey. She can just use her sense of smell and those heat sensory pits, and she'll be able to locate her prey exactly and hunt without the need for eyesight. So it's just an addition that allows her to hunt more effectively. And a lot of our pythons have got those, but the black-headed pythons and probably the woma pythons don't have the heat sensory pits, or not that I know of. And that's mainly because they're hunting cool-blooded prey, or ectotherms, the reptiles.
And when people have, so if you see a snake, and obviously if you firstly assume that all snakes, you don't know what sort it is, but if you do know it's a python, it doesn't mean that, yes, unless you get a very large one, but they're obviously harmless to us. But still, give them a wide berth. Don't go and pick up a snake just for the hell of it, because they still will bite.
Yes.
But all they want to do is get away. So,
yeah.
Obviously, this is one of the friendlier kind. How big can carpet pythons grow?
These can get up to around about 3 metres. It's not impossible in captivity to get them larger, and maybe even in the wild, in good conditions, but generally about 3 metres. You're not going to find too many above that. And as you say, generally pythons in Australia are not considered dangerous to us because they typically don't get big enough to eat us. And so that doesn't mean they can't give us a nasty bite, as you say.
However, you're in the Amazon or something like that.
Yeah,
anaconda would be a different story.
If you're dealing with something like an anaconda or a reticulated python from Southeast Asia, that's very different. They're certainly big enough to kill and consume us, or can get big enough to do that. the largest species in Australia, the scrub python or amethystine python from North Queensland, can get very large. And I believe there is one account of a person being killed by one of those, but not eaten. So I don't know the details of that particular event, but I did hear about it a few years ago. But generally our pythons are not going to try and eat us, but they are still essentially wild, and when you come across one in the wild, even if you know what it is, if you go and pick it up, it probably thinks you're going to eat it or try and eat it, and therefore it will defend itself accordingly. Now you can find them that won't bite, or that are reluctant to bite, but you'll find others
pythons
that
are
are
like Olives. On a few of the military courses, I've seen a few chickens come to grief at night for chicken lessons. Be taking that to
sure.
smell the wild.
Yeah. So no, they can. And look, a lot of people think pythons don't bite, or there's certain groups of snakes that don't bite. But essentially, all living snakes will bite. They have to for food. It's just whether or not they will bite us at a given time. And you can see Bo here, she's very reluctant to bite. She's been handled a fair bit, so she's quite used to this. And, sorry, that's just an alarm that's going off there. But, so they certainly can bite. And if you're bitten by a python, you'll end up with a lot of holes in you, because they have, probably, generally speaking, larger teeth than most elapids, because they don't have the option of letting their prey go and still and it dying. They have to hang on to it to kill it. So their teeth are adapted to hang on. And that's why they have large teeth and a lot of them.
Well, she's certainly beautiful.
Yeah, she's pretty cool.
Right, Luke, who have we got here?
So here we've got Lucifer. Now Lucifer, of course, is a black-headed python, but these black-headed pythons can sometimes be mistaken for other species of snakes, venomous species of snakes, especially because of the different shaped head. If you have a look there, you can see his head looks a lot different from a lot of our other python species, and so sometimes people will get them confused with.
It's not as wide as a python.
Yeah,
it's
that's
quite
right.
narrow and slender.
Yeah, and that's probably partly because these guys have a bit of a different diet to what a lot of our other pythons will eat. So most of our python species in Australia will typically prey on warm-blooded prey, so birds and mammals normally, and black-headed pythons, of course, they're a little different. So he's preying predominantly on reptiles. Doesn't mean he wouldn't eat a bird or a mammal, but most of his diet's going to be reptiles. So things like lizards and snakes, mostly. They tend not to eat a lot of turtles.
Right, no, they're a bit hard to
but certainly lizards and snakes, yeah.
Beautiful colours and markings.
Yeah, and you can see he's wrapped around my arm there.
A black-headed python's common?
As far as I know, they're not threatened or endangered or anything like that, but they're not as common as some of our other species. So the carpet pythons and olive pythons and things like that tend to be a little more common, but that probably also depends on the area that you're in. They'd certainly be more common in certain areas, but every now and then you'll see them around.
The muscles there, beautiful.
Yeah, he's very strong. These guys tend not to have quite the same body strength as some of our other pythons that climb. And I think that's because these are terrestrial. They spend a lot more time on the ground, whereas something like a carpet python, is quite happy to be up in the trees. Whereas this guy doesn't. It's not that he can't climb; he just doesn't spend as much time up there. So, but he's certainly strong enough to constrict his prey.
Beautiful markings.
Oh yeah,
yeah. The head's quite matte. You can sort of definitely see that sort of.
It's sort of a bit narrower.
Yeah, but you can it's
not as clearly defined either from the rest of the body as some of our other pythons.
They have a smile too that pythons, wherein a lappet just tends to have. Some of them just look mean.
Yeah, and the reason for looking mean like that, it's a really interesting point you raise, because when you look at this guy here,
we might do.
Sure, bring him in a little closer. If you have a close look, I
think it's a nice space anyway.
Be a little bit still there. You might notice his eye, if you can see, because his head's all black, but his eye doesn't have a strong brow ridge over the top like some of our other snakes. Now, when you look at some of our venomous snakes, death adders and brown snakes and taipans and things like that, you'll typically find that they have a strong brow ridge over the top. Now, there's quite a good chance that that's, at least in part, due to them just being diurnal. Now, not all of our venomous snakes are diurnal, and it's dependent on where they are as to the temperatures and stuff like that. But diurnal snakes or daytime snakes are more likely to have a strong brow ridge here to cut glare from the sun so they can maybe see a little bit better.
People say that about me.
It's certainly the case with some of our raptors. I think that's why they have a stronger brow ridge, so that they can, it's just an evolutionary advantage.
Yeah.
And
because of course they're mainly day hunters, aren't
they?
So
yeah, a lot of our raptors. Whereas you look at it now,
and the elapids, I'm not saying that.
Oh, sorry, yeah, a lot of those are out in the day, yeah, and even with elapids that do come out at night, they will be out in the day as well. So they're not strictly out at night, and so when you look at nocturnal snakes, you generally don't see a lot that have got a really strong brow ridge over the eye, and so it's not that they are mean necessarily. It's just a function of evolution that they have that brow ridge there, and it kind of makes them look mean. And
You've got a smile. and the scales. So how, as far as a python versus an elapid, say a poisonous land snake, what's the difference with the actual scale pattern?
So
I'm not sure Ken will pick that up. How the general, say, for people to identify one of the python versus a bitey one.
So there is obviously in Australia we've got more venomous species than non-venomous species. I believe we're the only country in the world that actually has more venomous species than non-venomous species. Now when I say that though, the majority of those venomous species are not considered dangerous to humans. They're dangerous to small creatures, but not to us. Having said that, we've got a lot that are dangerous to us. And so within the non-venomous species, you've got a few different groups. You've got pythons, but then there's some other snakes in there as well. And so when you're trying to identify whether a snake is venomous or non-venomous, you're looking at a bunch of things, including the scales. So with pythons, they tend to have a lot more scales and smaller scales across the dorsal surface, across the back, and then really narrow ventrals or belly scales. You can see they're not very wide there. If this snake here was a mulga,
we actually go a bit closer.
Sure can.
Just to see
if you can get a closer look.
They're
there,
not as wide.
So
a bitey one would have to be much smaller.
Well, if this was a mulga or a king brown of this, you can see the dorsal scales there. Of this size, these ventral scales would be much wider, much wider, and these dorsal scales would be much bigger, and there'd be a lot less of them across the back.
Right.
And so pythons tend to have smaller scales on the back and smaller, narrower ventrals and that kind of thing. But
and hence the shinier look generally, or is that not that sort of thing?
It does sort of vary a bit, but there are a number of other species that are non-venomous that aren't pythons that could be confused for venomous snakes because they won't necessarily have really small scales across the back. So scales is only one thing that we look at when we're trying to ID them. There's a range of other things. The eye shape that we were talking about before is one. The head shape is one. The patterning and the colour and the length and breadth of the snake, the thickness of the body. Also, we take into account whereabouts they are, when they're there, and what they're doing. Is it day, night, dusk, dawn? Are they in the water, up a tree, on the ground? Are they hiding, fleeing, hunting? All that kind of stuff we take into account. And then, and on top of that, you can do scale counts. So you can count dorsal scales across the back here. You can do ventral counts, subcaudals underneath the tail, and then the vent scale just here.
That's a lot of counting.
Yeah, well, typically, see, there's all these things that you can use, but you don't necessarily have to use if you get to a conclusion with what the snake is before you go through all that. So if we saw him in the bush right now, I'd take one look and go, all right, I can see his patterning, that distinct black head there, and go, all right, yep, this is a black-headed python. Having said that, he's out at a really unusual time of day. Like, he wouldn't normally be out at this time of day. Not impossible, but it means he's probably been disturbed. If we saw him at night, yeah, no problem. That's when he's likely to be out. So he'd be pretty easy to identify, but something else could be much harder to identify. And really, the way to know if it's venomous or non-venomous is going to be to identify correctly what species of snake we're looking at. Because nature doesn't really like the boxes that we try and put things into, and that means it's actually, there's so many exceptions to the rules that we have. So we can't just look at a snake and go, oh, it's got this shaped head or this type of scales, it must be venomous or non-venomous. We typically identify what it is, and therefore we know what it's not. It's a bit of a process of elimination. And with practice, you get pretty good after time. You know, most people could pick, if you've been working with snakes, most people could pick a black-headed python pretty quickly. But you know, a slaty grey might be different, or you know, a western brown, or a mulga, or something like that. So.
Okay, Luke. So different kind of snake here. What do we have here?
So this is what's called a slaty grey snake. It's actually a really common species found within this part of the NT, but probably not that well known. I mean, by the general public that don't typically recognise these ones. You know, a lot of people recognise pythons, but slaties, as I say, really common, not considered to be dangerous to humans at all.
But one of the venomous kind, nevertheless. Well, non-venomous?
Well, it's a good question. These have, for a long time, been seen as non-venomous. I have heard there's some debate now about whether they're considered mildly venomous, and there'll probably be some different opinions on that. But I haven't done any the research on these guys to know if, you know, it'll probably change whether they're considered venomous or not. But it's only mild and they're not dangerous. But the thing is, to a lot of people, they look like a venomous species, and therefore they get treated like a venomous species, which means that a lot of people will kill them. And it's a shame because, as you can see, Slippery here, she's a lovely snake. Slaty greys are known to be pretty feisty. There's certainly a risk she'll bite me here today. Not because she's annoyed at me, but she loves her food, and if she smells something that she thinks could be food on my hands, well,
hence the hand sanitizer on your belt.
Yes, you might have seen that hanging on my belt there, but that's what that's for. I'm not particularly afraid of germs, but but it stops Slippery here from smelling anything tasty on my hands. And but she's, as you can see, she's a really, really handleable snake. But in the wild, these are typically very feisty, and if you were to try and just pick up a wild slaty, you would be almost guaranteed that they will try and bite.
I see lots of them around here of a night with lots of and now slaty greys and keelbacks. Now they're the only snakes that can actually consume cane toads without dying. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, I know of certainly keelbacks, and I have heard that slaties have some tolerance to the toxin as well. So yeah, but definitely keelbacks do. But of course, you look at the size of her head. She's limited with the size of the toad she can eat. Snakes eat things much larger than their heads, but you know, if you get a big toad like this,
and
she's
some
just
big
not
ones
fit
around
in
here at night.
Yeah.
In fact, it's Frog City. I don't think I've ever seen so many toads.
Yeah, it is a good place for it. But she's she would go after a lot of frogs and that kind of thing, and so it is kind of good that they seem to be able to tolerate a bit of toad toxin. Otherwise, it would have had a devastating impact on them, as it has with a lot of our other snakes, native reptiles. Yeah. For sure. It's more our endemic reptiles than just our natives, ones that are found only here because they've never been exposed to bufo toxins and other similar toxins, whereas some of the snakes that are found in parts of Southeast Asia as well as here might have some exposure and therefore some tolerance. But some of the venomous species that we see in this region can, to an untrained eye, and even sometimes a trained eye, look similar to a slaty. Northern browns, mulgas, king browns. Now, you know, if you're well practiced at looking at a lot of snakes, then you'll probably pick them straight away. But if you're not, they will look very similar. You can see this snake, this girl here, she's brown, and she's actually about 1.5 meters long, so she's got a reasonable length to her, similar size to what you would see in a northern brown. Wouldn't be that unusual. And
growing up in New South Wales, we had lots of eastern browns.
Yeah.
And they had a bit of an attitude too. Some of the browns.
Oh yeah.
You can see, and they can be. Sure. You definitely couldn't do that with a brown.
No, the thing is, we wouldn't be able to do this with a slaty without her biting us either. But because we've worked a lot with her, she's been in captivity since she was hatched out of the egg. She was actually, somebody found her as an egg and brought her to us, and she was hatched here at the park. So she's been in captivity and had handling her whole life. So that's why she's good like this. It's extremely unusual to find a slaty like this, and a lot of other venomous species you're not gonna find like this. But it doesn't mean they can't be. It's just that very few people are willing to handle them like this to get them to that point. So,
And speaking on venomous snakes in Australia, out of the world's top 20, Australia has something like the top 10, and what would be I suppose, every snake which is the most dangerous one, the one that's in front of you at the time, I guess, and treated,
true.
But which would be the top 5, and what makes them the most dangerous?
Good question. It's actually pretty difficult when you're talking about most dangerous versus most venomous, because the two are different, although linked. So with regard to most venomous, Australia has the majority of the most venomous snakes in the world, and whether it's top 10 or top 20 is tricky to say, because snake species, the classifications of them change. So for example, at one point we had a range of different tiger snakes in Australia, and then I think they were compiled into very few species. It could have changed again now. Same with brown snakes. We've typically had a lot of different species of brown snakes, but the numbers of the species will change. The brown snake that we have here for a long time was known as the Western brown. Now it's a Northern brown.
They're all the Pseudonaja, aren't they?
Pseudonaja, that's right, yeah. And so how they fit into a list of venom toxicity is tricky. And for a lot of those snakes, there's not even a guarantee that venom tests have been done on that particular species or variation of a species. So it is tricky to say, but lists I looked at years ago had the world's top 10 most venomous species listed, and Australia had 9 of the 10. The common crobble was the only one in there at number 6, I think. But generally, the top 5 most venomous species generally recognised will be the inland taipan as number 1, the eastern brown snake is number 2, the coastal taipan is number 3, the eastern tiger snake is number 4, and the death adder is number 5. But with separation of those species, it can alter. And the thing is, most venomous doesn't necessarily translate to most dangerous, because an inland taipan, for example, that's highly venomous and considered the most venomous land snake in the world, it doesn't have as long of fangs as a coastal taipan. It therefore won't inject as much venom, has a different temperament, and is less likely to inject venom. And all of those things play into it if you encounter a snake. If you encounter many of our venomous species and you're bitten, you may have received what we call a dry bite, where you haven't received any venom. It's just like a warning to say, hey, can you leave me alone, and we'll all just go our separate ways. I haven't ever spoken to anyone that knows of a dry bite from a coastal taipan. So if you get a bite from one of those, it's probably the most serious snake bite you'll ever get. And because they will not only inject venom, but they will inject typically a huge amount of venom.
It can grow very big too.
They can get really large, and the venom is really, really toxic. So they are an extraordinarily serious snake. So that's why I think that the coastal taipan is far more dangerous than any of our other venomous species, even though some of them are more venomous than the coastal taipan. And so yeah, when you're looking at what's dangerous, some people consider what's dangerous by how many people they kill each year. In Australia, we don't have that many deaths from snakebite because we have a minimal population for our area, and we have good hospitals, good medical system, we have excellent antivenoms, and we've got good first aid. So those things minimise the number of deaths, whereas if you go to a country with a huge population, huge pressure on their medical system, not as wealthy, not as good antivenoms, and not as good first aid, you get a lot more people dying. So is that because the snake is more dangerous, or is it just because they're in a different situation to us? I think it's not necessarily as dangerous in those places, but they're in a different situation. So, yeah,
Interesting.
So she's behaving really well today.
Gorgeous. It's my appreciation of snakes. The more you know about it, knowledge is power.
Yeah,
the less you have to worry about. I mean, the common thing I get, what about snakes? Camping out in the ground, what about snakes? I've never ever had a problem. I don't worry about it. It's even when I've seen dangerous, or venomous snakes, they tend to leave you alone. Once you've got a fire going, and I've always making sure I've got the correct PPE, boots, and I'm just, dressed for the bush. I'm not wearing thongs in an area like this. I'm always making sure there's certain areas you can go where you they look snaky, and you can look at an area and think, you know, it's probably likely I'm going to see such and such sort of snake here. So you should be dressing appropriately. Because most people that get bitten are it's really idiots really that are trying to catch a snake that shouldn't be, or they've antagonised a snake, or rare occasion just bad luck, just sticking their hand into somewhere without really looking and paying attention.
Yeah, that's right. The majority of bites are on people who are either trying to catch or kill the snake. It's probably 90 to 95% of the bites. And then there are, as you say, a few rare unlucky ones that happen to stand on a snake. You know, it's bad luck. And that can happen, but yeah, certainly mostly it's people who've picked the snake up or are trying to kill it that get bitten. Generally, snakes don't want to fight humans. It's just too dangerous for the snake. They've got no interest in eating us, so they're just as happy to be left alone. And if we give them their space, normally they'll take the option to just go the other way.
Especially if you're walking around. I suppose the only time when I see a snake is if you're quiet and it happens to come across your position.
Yep.
But on the ground, I find with a 5, never ever had it clear back to the ground. I've never.
Yeah.
I've heard stories of snakes in sleeping bags and that type of thing. But you know, if you camp, roll your sleeping bags up. Don't stick them out until the night you got your mozzie net. And as such, when you got your mozzie nets, always put it around you. But never really had an issue.
No, if snakes come into camp, they're typically just moving through. I was in Tassie end of 2019, and I was just sitting at camp, and a copperhead just came sliding through camp, and I just watched it. I just followed it for a little bit and watched it, but it was just moving through, going about its business. And yeah, it's not unusual, and if you just leave them be, they're generally not going to cause you any problems.
Okay, Luke, before we talk about being bitten, can you tell me a little bit about, say, what people should be wearing in the bush?
Sure.
Why, and is there a big difference between people that aren't dressed correctly?
Yeah, sure. So most of our venomous snakes are not going to be able to bite through like the pants that you've got on there. They're going to struggle to get sort of much venom into you through that. Some of them can if they get a good bite, but pants are a great way of avoiding snake envenomation, sort of generally. But solid footwear like this, if you're out in thongs, then you're going to be much more likely to get a bite on the foot. These here, a lot of people ask me if these are for snakes. I tell them they're for crocodiles. No, these are actually for grass seeds and water and stuff like that. But
good old gators.
Yeah, but I mean they can help to protect against snake bite on the lower part of the limb there. But of course, if you're wearing pants, you know, and solid footwear, you're going to have unless you're trying to catch or kill a snake, very little risk of being bitten and envenomated by a snake. Most of the time, if they strike at the pants, it's probably not going to get you. Doesn't mean it can't happen, but it's just really unlikely.
Now, it is hot up here. I mean, I know that. I mean, I've got good solid boots.
Yeah.
As well, but I know what that feeling's like.
Yeah. So having said that, that's the thing. In a place like this, I generally don't wear pants just because it's so hot. So you know, I understand there'll be people out there that will wear shorts, but if you're concerned about snake bite, then pants are definitely the way to go. And obviously, if you're somebody that has to be handling snakes for whatever reason, then long sleeves are actually really good as well, because if your hands are near snakes and they strike, it can bite your lower arm as well. So people will have their own preferences about gloves. I probably wouldn't necessarily go for gloves because that affects your feel, and that might not be. It's up to each person, their preference there. But yeah, that's probably some of the main stuff with regard to just avoiding snake bites. But if you happen to be bitten, even through a pair of pants, why don't we go through? So, let's say that you've been bitten by a snake. Of course, the first thing to do is to make sure you won't be bitten again. So if you've stood on it, accident, bitten you in the leg, first thing you want to do, a lot of people say call for help, but no, the first thing you want to do is get off the snake, move away, or let the snake move away from you. And once you've not been bitten, once you're not going to be bitten again, then we want you to stay nice and calm. We get you on the ground, just sit down like this, and then what we're going to do, we won't call for help yet. We want to get some broad pressure bandages onto the limb firstly. Now, if it's a torso, it's very difficult. If it's torso, head, neck area, it's really hard to put much pressure on there. If you can put pressure on, do, but It's tricky to do it and still, be able to breathe and all that kind of thing. You need to get help as soon as possible. But if it's on a limb, there's a lot more we can do. So what we might do is take your boot off here, and of course the reason
that's travelling up the lymphatic system, isn't it?
That's correct. Yeah. So the venom typically will move in the lymphatic system, and so what we want to do is put broad, even, firm pressure on the lymph system, which is just under the skin, basically. You can leave that on or take it off. We can leave it on today if you like. But what you may need to do, if you're doing first aid on either yourself or someone else, is just cut a hole in the toe of the sock. And the reason for that is to make sure that our bandage isn't on too tight, and we can check the blood flow to the toes. Same with fingers. If you put a bandage on, you can check the fingers. But you want to take off any jewellery, watches, rings, boots, that kind of stuff, because that will...
Toe rings? I don't have one of those.
Toe rings, absolutely. Any jewellery. If anyone had a lot of women wear ankle chains, just like bracelets and stuff. But we want to take that off, because if this reacts to the venom and swells, you got a tourniquet, and that's not what we want. So we want the broad, even pressure rather than a tourniquet. And so you can bandage over pants like this. That's fine. The bandage will still work. You don't have to.
Doesn't affect it. Unless they're like really thick.
Yeah, like if they're really thick, if you think they'll stop the bandage, then you might need to cut the leg off or take the pants off or whatever. But these pants should be fine. They're fairly soft. Now I've got a couple of bandages here, and I'll show you how they both sort of work. This one's the sort of the common crate bandage that we find in most first aid kits, around Australia, and these will work fine if that's all you've got. And I'll show you how to do that shortly. This one here, of course, is the more specified things like snakebite, and it gives an indicator through these rectangles here as to the amount of pressure you put on. And when you get that rectangle to a square like that, then you've got a suitable amount of pressure. So that's a really good bandage for someone that's not familiar with using bandages and doesn't know how much pressure to apply. If you've been doing a lot of bandaging, or you've really done a lot of first aid courses, then you probably can use one of these and get by without any problems. But these are probably a better quality and more robust bandage. So we'll try and put on both these, and we'll see how we go. Nothing else in your pocket there.
All that.
So if you're a patient that has been bitten, I'll be wanting you to just relax. I'd probably even get your back against a tree, but if you're comfortable there, you're all right there.
Cool. No, it's good.
And then we'll just start now.
Of course, I'll be panicking by now. It depends, I guess. Most people would be panicking.
Yeah, and look, a person's panic in your situation, a person's panic level will probably depend on what the first aider is telling them. So if it's a second person and they're saying, Gordon, that was a brown snake, you could die, you might die, then of course you will panic. But if they're saying, no, look, it's just a snake bite, we'll get you fixed up, you'll be fine, we'll get you off to hospital, you'll be fine, then that's going to present a different result. But if the first aider is yourself, again, it depends on what you tell yourself. So having been in the situation myself, having done first aid on myself for snake bite, when I was bitten, I remember thinking that I would be fine. Like I thought, I'll just put the bandages on, I'll be okay. So what you tell yourself makes a big difference too. Now, so we'll start the actual first aid, I believe, the latest first aid. Let's say you're bitten here above the boot. The actual first aid is to put a small bandage on the bite site, and then initially, and then bandage the whole limb as much as you've got bandage for. Now we won't do that today because I don't have a little bandage, so I'll just start and bandage the whole limb.
Because there are so many different variants of this, isn't there?
Yeah, look, every
first aid course I've done, and
it does change. I've done a number of first aid courses. I can't even count how many now, but it has changed over the years. It used to be start here and go down and then up, and then they changed it to going I think it was just up, and then so a few different ones. Currently it's one on here and then up. The idea, I think, being get pressure on that immediately and then cover the limb. But a lot of the time you might not have that. So the main thing though is to cover as much of the limb as you can as quickly as possible with the broad, even pressure. So that's what we'll do. And when we put the bandage on, of course, if we try and put it on this way, it's going to be a bit awkward to continue to roll it. This way is a lot easier. So we'll start with this one, and it can be a little bit tricky to get the pressure, to get enough pressure right at when you're first putting the bandage on. But as soon as you've got a couple of wraps on there, it's going to be a lot easier to get the pressure. How's that feel?
Yeah,
pretty firm?
good. Nice and firm.
Yeah. Now,
sprained ankle firm.
yeah, and that's about right. That's about what you want. You want it about similar pressure to what you'd have a sprain. Now these, because of another thing you can do once they've got the boot off is just pop the foot on the shoe there to give you a little bit of elevation off the ground, so you can get the bandage under there. And of course, the leg we want to be nice and relaxed. So when I'm moving the leg, I don't want you, the patient, to move it at all. I want to do all the lifting. The reason for that is because with the venom traveling in the lymphatic system, the venom will be forced through the system if you continue to move your muscles. And so we want to minimize that muscular movement as much as possible.
Is it only muscles on the bitten limb? Say for example, if I was bitten in the arm, but I was able to walk, is it just that muscle, or is it any
as
muscle?
far as I know, yeah, it's the muscle that's near those lymph or in that limb, yeah. And so it's
that's what we got, secondary muscles that come into play with any muscle.
yeah. So basically, if you're bitten in the arm and you splint the arm or keep the arm still, you should be okay to walk. It's the muscular movement in this limb that will force it through this area of the lymph system, as best I understand it. So you see there, we had that's one of the reasons that these specific snakebite bandages, it's a good idea to have at least a couple if you're going to have these instead of the crepe ones. See, because they're thicker, you don't get as much distance. They're not as long a bandage. The crepe ones are a little bit thinner, and therefore you get more distance out of them. Now I'm just going to tuck this in here. That feels pretty firm still.
Yep, that's good.
We're going to tuck that in there. That looks like it's holding. And we're going to use this to continue on. I'll go this way. Now, as long as you're getting this bandage on in sort of a few minutes, you're going to give yourself a really good chance of survival. So you can just relax your leg, and I'll just lift him as I come around there. You can see that's sort of some broad.
Yeah, I can feel the difference in the pressure between the two types of bandages.
Can you?
Yeah.
That's interesting, because I haven't checked with anyone in the past the difference. This one's more pressure?
Yeah, you can definitely feel the, I mean that's tight, but that's even tighter.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah, so I'd say if you're out there and you've got the option of the two bandages, definitely go with this one if you can. And I'm just going to pull that a little tighter. And then you'll sort of give yourself the best chance. Now, we want to call for help, but we don't want to call for help just yet. I mean, unless you've got someone that can do that. If you've got a third person, I
suppose if I'm here, I could do it.
You could potentially do it, yeah. But the main thing, it's a little bit like when you're doing CPR, or if you have to do CPR, and you're the only person that's there that can do it. Your best option is to do the CPR and call around the act of CPR. So put them on speaker, get someone else to call, whatever, because the CPR has to happen. And it's a bit like this bandage. It has to get put on within a few minutes, because if we don't, every moment we delay this, we decrease that person's chances of survival significantly. So we've got that on there, that's pretty firm. And now, if we don't have to move you, if I can get an ambulance or ambulance officers to come here to this point, then that's what we'll do. And I wouldn't worry about splinting the leg, because you're not going to move, but just make sure you're comfortable, hydrated, and just relax. But if for whatever reason you had to move, then we'd probably look at splinting the leg, just to make sure that you're not moving those muscles, keeping that as still as possible.
Either to a stick or to the other leg.
Yeah,
like
yeah. If you're in a situation where you have to walk to get help because you're by yourself, there's no phone service or people can't get to you, it's a bit of a tricky situation. You might need to bandage your leg like this, splint it so it stays straight, and just try and use it as minimally as possible. It's a bit of a tricky one. It will depend on the circumstance, and there's not a single good answer that's going to work for every single circumstance. So yeah, it can be a bit difficult. But basically, once this is on, assuming we've got something to write with, we could mark the time and the location of the bite, and that way, if I'm not there, or it's just you're by yourself and you happen to be unconscious when you get to hospital, the medical staff will know, okay, he was bitten here at this time, and we know where the bite is. And that means they don't have to take the bandage off and look for the bite. They can just cut a piece out. They'll take a blood test and maybe a swab from the bite side if they've got that option as well. And then they'll try and identify the venom, if you've got any, because we don't know yet whether you've got any venom. We have to assume though that you do and treat it, because if we wait until we see symptoms, then it's not good. So yeah, we want to get you off to hospital, and they'll get you checked out, and yeah, if anti-venom is needed, then they will administer it. But if they don't think it's required, they won't give it to you, because it's not going to be a fun experience to have anti-venom. It'll definitely make you very sick. So yeah, it's not.
And does that accumulate more? So if you were bitten, obviously, I mean, hopefully you never get more than once. I suppose it could.
I have heard suggestions that people build up a tolerance, but I think in humans, because of from random bites in humans, we're much less likely to build up any kind of suitable tolerance to a particular snake venom, because in the case of snake handlers that have been bitten by lots of different snakes, there's a lot of different venoms, and there's all sorts of different toxins in those venoms, different components. And when they make anti-venom, as best I understand that, they inject very small amounts of snake venom, typically into horses, although they might use other animals in certain places. But typically into horses, they'll inject small amounts on a consistent basis till the horse builds a tolerance to the venom, and then they draw a sample from the horse and refine it and use that as anti-venom. So I think the idea of humans building that tolerance, I think you'd probably have to do it very methodically like that and control the amount of venom to build a realistic, suitable tolerance. Like, I just don't see humans ending up in a situation where they can go, I can get bitten by this and I'll be fine. And if somebody does get bitten by something and is fine, it's probably because it's a dry bite or very minimal amount of venom. So rather than a tolerance to the venom. So yeah.
And so that's all bandaged up. I've either splintered that, and you always bring the other leg to that leg, something soft in there.
Yep.
So I can't, of course, but the nature of a lot of wilderness things is we're out on our own, as you're saying. So
right.
That becomes an issue, and of course you do. And traditionally, Aboriginal people would have that problem. I know they traditionally buried people in certain areas and fed and watered them to stop them.
Yep, I've heard that.
Being able to move, and of course it's mess the neighbour just literally, because I suppose it's a slower process, and eventually they let their bodies fight the toxin at a slower rate, depending on what snake and how much venom, how much the venomation there was. Yeah, really.
Yeah, so that's
so many things at play.
That's correct. Yeah, it does. If you say for Indigenous people before we had anti-venoms or anything like that. Basically remaining still and giving your body as much time as possible to process and break down the toxins or excrete the toxins would be the best option, because there just weren't any other options really. And so yeah, remaining still and not moving is really key. It's really important. So we want to do that as much as possible. But
like having the correct thing, because obviously if you don't have a crate bandage or something you can use, you're not going to be able to get that broad cover, even if you've got material and bandanas, which is
difficult.
Great. It's not, you wouldn't be able to get unless you've be able to make cordage and a long length of it to get that, but you wouldn't get that broad pressure like that.
Yeah, it would be difficult. If you had some clothing like t-shirts, especially any kind of stretching material, it wouldn't be completely useless, but it wouldn't be nowhere near as good as a crate bandage. So for the price of a crate bandage or one of these snakebite bandages to chuck in your first aid kit, one or two of those in there is the main component that you need to deal with snakebite. The other thing I would say is, especially if you're heading somewhere really remote, there's two things. Let someone know where you're going, and the other one is have some kind of device that can get you help if you need it. So in some areas, mobile phones.
Spare batteries, exactly.
So in some areas, mobile phones, you know, they will work, but in a lot of the territory, mobile phone, you're not going to get any reception on. So for me, I use a PLB, a personal locator beacon, and that's a great, so they're expensive enough, they cost a few $100s, but in a survival situation, you get a snake bite, especially from a serious snake, and you potentially could die. You activate that PLB, and it's an excellent way to get assistance in a really remote area that you otherwise wouldn't get any assistance in. So, you know, either that or having someone else that knows where you are, you've got a time that you're going to be back, where they know if you're not back, it's time to go looking for you, all that kind of thing. That's really good practice to have those in place, because they can just get you out of a lot of trouble, save your life. So, yeah.
Okay.
Cool.
Well, that's fantastic.
No
Luke.
worries. All right, well, we might take that
All
bandage
right.
off.
That's really good to know, and that would stay on until you get to hospital.
Well, yeah, it can actually stay on longer. When I went to a hospital with a snake bite, I put 2 bandages on. It was on my finger, this one, and I put 2 bandages on myself. And then when I got to a nearby house, the lady in the house, she put a 3rd bandage on just to make sure it was all done correctly and thoroughly. And I went to hospital, and they took me to a different hospital by ambulance. I was okay, like I felt fine, but went to a different hospital, a larger hospital that probably had anti-venoms, because the small rural one I went to didn't. And then they kept the bandage on overnight, the whole night on my arm. And so by the next day, like I'd had that pressure on my hand and my arm all night. My hand was pretty sore the next day. Wow. And it had tiger snake venom in it, so that added to the pain as well. So yeah, it's certainly worthwhile knowing, because it mightn't be, like, it might save your life, but it mightn't be your life. It could be a child's life, or, you know, another family member or a friend or a complete stranger, but somebody will be thankful that you knew it. So
definitely.
yeah.
And it's something we all should like all other first aid as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's certainly it's not a hindrance to carry around that knowledge, for sure.
Well, it's been wonderful talking to you, Luke. I've learnt so much about snakes, and I look forward to coming back again.
Sure.
And perhaps we can do something again in the future.
Yeah, no worries. Wow.
Okay.
Thanks for coming along.
No
Thanks,
worries.
Gordon.
Thanks, Luke.
Catch ya.